Mamoon will talk about a coherent backscattering of entangled photon pairs.
See if it works. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. To my understanding, this is the last parallel session at CLEO. I don't know if I should take it as a good thing or a bad thing that I'm presenting at the very last session, but I'll be quite positive about it and say that it's good. So my name is Mamoon Safadi. I'm a PhD candidate in Professor Yoram Vermig's lab at the Hebrew University. And in this talk, I want to present you with a lot of our findings on this phenomenon that we call coherent backscattering of entangled photon pairs. So for starters, let us just imagine the following situation. Suppose we have here a medium that we're illuminating with coherent light, and we place a screen in reflection and ask ourselves, what does the intensity pattern look like on this screen? Well, what we observe is the following grainy pattern. And this grainy pattern is due to the fact that the light can travel through many different paths inside the medium. And essentially what we see at each point on the screen is simply their interferences. So whenever we see a bright spot, it corresponds to the constructive interference of all these paths. And whenever we see a dark spot, it corresponds to their destructive interference. Now, and this is typically what we call in the literature a speckle pattern. Now, suppose we were to average out these reflected speckles. How can we do that? We can, for example, start taking the scattering medium and displacing it in space. What we would have expected to naively see after summing out all these different realizations of the speckle is that we just get a homogeneous intensity distribution on the screen, and all these interferences that I've shown you will just get washed out. However, when researchers conducted this experiment back in the mid-80s, this is not what they observed. What they've seen is that on top of the homogeneous intensity distribution, there existed an enhanced area of light, as you can see here. And this enhancement was in the precise backscattering direction only. And it was actually a 2-to-1 enhancement, and its width scales like the wavelength divided by the transport mean free path of the medium. This phenomenon became known as coherent backscattering, or CBS for short, and sometimes it's also called weak localization of light. Now, it begs the question, why is there even an enhancement in the backscattering direction precisely relative to any other position? Well, it exists because of the fact that there's an interference effect between reciprocal paths. What do I mean by that? Let us imagine just this yellow ray that enters through the medium. It goes through some sequence of scatterers and gets backscattered from it. There exists a path, the red arrow that you see here, that travels through the same sequence of scatterers as the yellow one and backscatters as well. So when we look at the precise backscattering angle, these two paths accumulate essentially the same phase. And this is why, and since they accumulate the same phase, when we look at the precise backscattering direction, they interfere constructively with one another. And this is why we observe coherent backscattering there. Now, this phenomenon has been well studied since the mid-80s, and people have seen it with a wide variety of different scattering configurations, from things that are as simple as a white piece of paper to more complex scattering systems, just like cold atom gases or biological tissues in human bones. However, the scheme in which this experiment is done is typically always the same. You take a well-collimated laser beam that illuminates the sample that you want to probe, and you collect the backscattered light from it. At no point did people really consider what would happen if we were now to change the source itself, but not the medium. And this is exactly what we asked ourselves. We asked ourselves, what would happen if you were now to change this coherent light source, this classical light source, with a non-classical light source? And more specifically, a source for entangled photon pairs. Now, since I'm saying entangled photon pairs, let me just say a few words on how we create these at the lab. We use a process that's called spontaneous parametric down conversion, or SPDC in short. And essentially what happens in this process is that we have a nonlinear crystal that is being pumped by a very powerful laser beam. And occasionally, or actually quite rarely, a pumped photon splits into two daughter photons that we typically call the signal and the idler. And what characterizes them is that they're being emitted at many different angles from the crystal. And now, if we were to place two detectors in front of the down-converted light, one that is fixed and the other transversely scanning, and we were to collect their coincidence counts, meaning the simultaneous arrival of photons to both detectors, we would observe a very narrow peak in the far field. And this narrow peak is due to the fact that these photons are anti-correlated in their momentum, meaning that upon measuring the angle at which one of the photons was emitted, say that of the idler, its twin, the signal, is bound to be detected at the precise opposite angle. And if you wanted to describe it as a quantum state of the diamond converted light, it would essentially look something like this. Each ket here represents the state of the signal and the idler. And you can see while the signal has some transverse momentum Qn, its twin has the exact opposite momentum. And this summation is being done over all the different modes that are emitted from the crystal. And now we take this nonlinear crystal, we place it in front of the scattering medium, we place the detectors in reflection, and we ask ourselves what happens there. So before I present you with the results to this type of experiment, let me just say a technical word about the scattering geometry that we use in experiment. So just like I said at the beginning, CBS, it's a very robust and universal phenomenon. And essentially any system that scatters the light can be exploited here to observe CBS. And specifically here, we use what is called the double passage configuration, which consists of a thin diffuser with some divergence angle theta naught, behind which we place a mirror at some finite distance L. Now, why do we do this? Why not just use a multiply scattering medium? Well, the reason being is that there's something that I didn't tell you about this SPDC light. It is typically very, very weak. It's a very, very inefficient nonlinear process. And so you can imagine that now we're adding scattering to that. It would take us an unreasonable amount of time to collect the data and get a sufficient SNR. And so in this type of system, we have a controlled type of scattering. And as I will show you later on, it actually gives us a very nice feature that by simply tuning the distance between the diffuser and the mirror, we can actually control also the CBS cone width. Okay, and now on to the results. When we look only at the single counts, meaning the intensity pattern that is collected by the scanning detector, we essentially observe a relatively flat intensity distribution. And we observe no coherent phenomenon like speckles or coherent backscattering. And this homogeneous intensity distribution is actually due to the fact that the medium is being essentially illuminated with multimode light. It's an incoherent illumination of the medium itself because we have many, many different pairs that are illuminating the scattering medium. Okay, however, when we looked at the coincidence counts, meaning the correlations between the two detectors, we observed a clear signature of coherent backscattering. We saw a 2-to-1 enhancement in the precise backscattering direction. Essentially, how one can think of what happens here is that these two photons impinge onto the medium, they get scattered once, their correlations get scrambled and lost. However, upon backscattering, once we measure one of the photons with the static detector, its twin collapses into a speckle pattern. And when this speckle pattern starts being averaged out over the different realizations, CBS pops out. And so then we wanted to test out, is this something specific only for the distance that we measured, or is it something more universal than that? So we went ahead and started varying the distance between the diffuser and the mirror and measured the CBS cone width as shown here. So green diamonds are the experimental data that we collected, and the green curve is the theoretical prediction that we had. And of course, we want now to compare this to classical CBS to see if it's distinguished in any way relative to the classical cone. And so we went ahead and did a classical CBS experiment, or actually an analog to a classical CBS experiment. And you can see the data here in blue. We've seen that at all the different distances that we measured, the 2-photon CBS cone was always narrower than the classical cone, as you can see. And what we found out actually is that while the width of the classical cone scaled like the wavelength divided by L times theta naught, which is essentially just the transverse size on the diffuser, the 2-photon CBS scaled like the wavelength divided by twice L times theta naught. So that's very nice. Okay. And now we ask ourselves, is this something that's only specific to this double passage configuration that we used in experiment, or is it a more general phenomenon than that? Can we also observe this 2-photon CBS and its features that we saw also in a truly multiply scattering medium. And so we did some thorough theoretical analysis and numerical analysis on this, which I will show you now. But before that, let me just remind you something that I said at the beginning and just introduce you in a few words to the jargon that's typically used in this field. So if we look at the disordered average reflected intensity, which I call here RBA, A being the input mode and B being the output mode, then what people found out is that it's dominated by two terms only. And these two terms are essentially what is called the diffusion, okay? So it's all the path pairings of the field, which you see here as a solid line, and its conjugate, the dashed line, that travel through the same sequence of scatterers inside the medium and before being detected in mode B. This is essentially just an incoherent summation of all these different paths, and this is what gives the homogeneous background that we saw earlier. And the second term, the term that is responsible for the coherent backscattering cone, is typically called the Cooper-1, and it corresponds to all the path pairings of the field and its conjugate that travel through the same sequence of scatterers, but in a reversed manner. Okay, now we consider correlations in the two photon CBS experiment. So we need to look at the four field correlation function, which I call here gamma BA. And when we look at the disordered average correlation function, it's essentially what we found out is that it's also dominated by two leading terms, even though we found that there are many, many other diagrammatic contributions. And these two terms that we find out are a generalization to the diffusion and the Cooper-1 in the Cooper-1 that I've shown you in the previous slide. Now it looks a bit cumbersome. Let me just, but there's a very nice way to think of this experiment. We can think of it as a single photon that impinges onto the medium with mode A and travels through some sequence of scatterers, leaves it, and then virtually gets re-injected back into it, undergoing another scattering sequence before being detected in mode B. So the B diffusion corresponds to all the path pairings that travel through the same sequence of scatterers in both scattering events and gets detected in mode B. And the B Cooper-1 corresponds to all the path pairings that are time reversed to one another. And when we look at this result, it essentially means that the two photon CBS cone should be that of the classical cone, but squared. And so we wanted to test this out also numerically. And this is what you see in this slide. So in blue, you see the classical CBS, and green, you see the two photon CBS. So one prediction is already confirmed. The two photon CBS is narrower than the classical CBS. And what we saw is that once we square the blue dots, which is here indicated by the orange curve, it overlaps very nicely with the two photon data that we recorded. Okay, so just to quickly summarize, we experimentally observed coherent backscattering of non-classical light, especially entangled photon pairs. Our theory showed that this phenomenon that we observed is not something specific to our experiment, but it's also something that's more universal than that. Our numerical simulations have shown agreement with our theoretical model, and something that I did not have time to show here is that the narrowing of the CBS cone width could essentially give a better estimation of the transport mean-free path that characterizes the medium. So classical CBS is typically used to measure this quantity, the transport mean-free path, but the narrowing that we observed could potentially give a better estimation of it. So just like to thank our collaborators, Wei Shu from University of Southern California, Arthur Gucci from Institut Langevin, my colleague Uhad Lib, and of course my supervisor, Professor Yaron Bomber. Thank you for listening, and we have an archive on this that was published like a month or so ago. You're more than welcome to read it, and I'll be happy to take any questions.